Hello, my name is Paul Moon and I teach history at the Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. What I'd like to do in this short presentation is examine some of the prophecies of apocalypse and utopia made by the Maori religious leader Kēnana in the early decades of the 20th century, and particularly to look at how these prophecies functioned as an antidote to his followers' cultural and physical displacement, which had occurred during the colonial era in the 19th century, and also to look at how Rua used prophecies of an impending apocalypse as a means of galvanizing support for his religious movement and the community that he built around that movement. Britain's colonization of New Zealand provides both the backdrop and, in a way, the pedigree for Rua Kēnana's apocalyptic movement. The consequences of war, mass land alienation, and disease resulted in the Maori population plummeting in the 19th century, to the point where by the close of the century it was estimated that there may be only around 40,000 Maori left in the country, and that they were, in the phrase at the time, a dying race. And this presents fertile ground for apocalyptic movements to grow and flourish. Rua Kēnana was a prophet, religious and community leader and healer from the Tūhoe tribe in the North Island of New Zealand, and he founded a sect known as Iharaira, which is a transliteration of Israel or Israelites. The sect's doctrines emerged from a previous Maori sect known as Ringatu, but Rua's sect combined both traditional Maori beliefs with biblical doctrine, and there was a strong emphasis on certain Old Testament narratives, especially those of exile, a promised land, a chosen people, a covenant with God, and the idea of being strangers in the land. And it's easy to see how these themes would have resonated with those of his followers who had suffered very badly during the colonial era. One of Rua's earliest prophecies was made in 1906, where he announced that he would meet Edward VII. He further announced that Edward VII would donate some diamonds to him and hand over control of the country to the prophet. The meeting never took place, but Rua managed to salvage his reputation from the situation by pointing out to his followers that he didn't need to meet the king anyway because he was now king himself. By 1916, the New Zealand public was becoming very well aware of the horrors of the First World War. And that year, Rua made a prophecy that the Germans would be victorious and that Rua's followers would prosper in New Zealand when the country fell under German rule. It was close to promising some sort of cataclysm, and it accords with popular versions of the idea of an apocalypse. And it was certainly suggesting something that was culturally, socially, and politically revolutionary. And after this apocalypse, again, Rua and his followers would be at the centre of the new New Zealand. Not all of Rua's prophecies failed. Following the construction of Hiona, his temple and meeting house, in 1908 on the sacred mountain of Maunga Pohatu, Rua announced to his followers that one day the government of New Zealand would have a similarly designed house. The prophecy was scoffed at by most people at the time, but in 1964 the Scottish architect Sir Basil Spence designed the Beehive, the building for the New Zealand government, and there is some resemblance to Rua's unusual design. In 1927, Rua proclaimed that the end of the world was about to occur. In the face of a gradually dwindling number of followers, this sort of apocalyptic prophecy, especially one that was destined to take place in the very near future, served to firm up the faith of the members of his community. He predicted that there would be 2 weeks of total darkness, followed by lightning and a deluge flooding the entire country, and only his followers would be saved. He also predicted that stars would fall from the sky and that Christ would return to be reunited with Rua, and Rua now identified himself as Christ's brother. In the following months, Rua and his adherents engaged in intense Bible study, with no one permitted to leave the community for more than a single night. And in case the prophecy didn't come to pass, he inserted a caveat that if the world didn't end when and where he described, it would certainly happen by the year 2000, and this gave his community extra time to prepare for this apocalypse. Over the course of the early decades of the 20th century, Rua's apocalyptic prophecies have become more extreme, more pronounced. Also, he began to identify himself differently, going from being a prophet to some sort of mouthpiece of God, to being a brother of Christ and then Christ himself. And his apocalyptic prophecies about the end of the world and delivering a subsequent utopia really fed his followers' apocalyptic imagination. It was an antidote to their present circumstances, and it relied on something that was even more dramatic than the drama they had experienced during the colonial era. And there were three particular traits in common with Rua's apocalyptic movement. Firstly, there was a rejection of the present world and a longing for an alternative one to be achieved through some sort of radical transformation or revolution. There was also an underlying ideology which emphasized the coming golden age. And thirdly, a vagueness about the precise means by which this new society would be brought about. Rua died in 1937, by which time the community he had formed on Maunga Pohatu, the sacred mountain of Tūhoe, had all but collapsed. The effects of the Depression, a succession of failed prophecies, economic difficulties in the community, the spread of disease, all contributed to disillusionment among his followers. There was also the inherent flaw of a utopian vision, which would require everyone to share the identical view in what that future perfect society would look like. And Rua never really articulated that utopia with sufficient detail.